Hi, this is Dr. P, and I'm going to try to describe differences between old school and new school in RPGs. Now, here's the background. I was planning to attend an RPG convention in my state, and I asked the organizers what topic they'd like me to talk about. Quote, I would think a talk on how to design or key elements of an old school tabletop role-playing game that are essential, unquote. So here's my analysis, which leans fairly heavily on a two-part Worlds of Design column that I wrote for eonworld.org. These are not really new ideas. What is called old school in RPGs has always been with us in hobby games of all types, just as new school has partially manifested in party and family games. It's called old in RPGs because the original players of RPGs were wargamers, who are now, of course, elderly, who were used to having to earn something when they played a game. Now we have lots of non-war gamers, often non-gamers, period, playing RPGs, so they're the new. And they're often interested in stories, not really in games at all. So there are different kinds of attitudes, and one of the most important is the attitude toward failure. And this doesn't come from the rules really, but from the attitudes of the players and especially the GM. So in old school, you're playing a game, you're not storytelling. You can fail in a game. You can't fail when you're being told a story. You have to earn what you get. You don't just participate and get all the benefits. Another way to put this is consequence versus reward. What you do is consequential for the result of the game. Whereas in new school, you get rewarded for participation and you're going to be taken care of. So again, the question is, can you fail? It's group oriented. The good of the group, not the individual, is what counts in old school. There's no need to let each person shine each game or do something cool or feel like a big deal. It is cooperative, not individualistic. There's no one-man army individualism here, we would hope, although Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition was very much one-man army, but 4th edition was much more cooperative and 5th as well. Keep in mind, in the USA, we have a big problem with individualists who are happy to thumb their noses at the community and at everybody else in a variety of ways. And those individualists are the ones who want to do something cool or shine or feel like a big deal. At least that's often an association. Now, what about stories? Each game has a story, but the question is, who makes the story? In old school, you let the players make their own story. So as GM, you set up a situation. You don't impose a story on the game. Yes, there should be objectives, but often those will come from the players, not the GM. For example, as a player, I tend to think of the game as a war of good and evil. Now, I do that as a GM as well, but the players don't have to participate in that way if they don't want to. As with any game, and unlike puzzles, the players decide how to get to where they're going. So let players decide. In other words, let players have agency, as it's called. Old school games are often about exploration, about finding and identifying the objectives, and also about recognizing when something about a location or an opponent makes it too dangerous to take on right now. The players must decide to say no sometimes. In new school, it's not too dangerous generally, and the players just go along with whatever the GM provides. Let the players provide the impetus and the decisions, not the GM. Now, not all players are going to like this, of course, especially those who want to be told a story rather than play a game. Highs require lows. If a session is always full of light and easy pickings, the whole will become tedious in the long run. This is the premise behind pacing in all kinds of storytelling. You've got to have lows and highs to make the highs more valuable. Brilliant adventures and scenes require some dull ones, even failures, for contrast. Old school accepts this. New school typically rejects it. What about constraints? Any game, of course, is an artificial set of constraints. Contemporaries generally, I'm talking about the populace as a whole, are especially unhappy about constraints of all kinds. There's lots of reasons for this, which we won't go into. But it's a reason why so many people really want to do puzzles, not play games. In a puzzle, they always know that if they do the right thing, they will solve the puzzle. Old school has lots of constraints, for example, alignment and level limits for certain species, or what are called races in D&D, but they're species. The possibility of failure is itself a huge constraint. In old school, there's much less hand-holding. Now, modern video games are often about hand-holding. The player gets lots of advice and help from the game, although in Euro-style tabletop games, sometimes they get it from other players. In video games, the developers are never supposed to let a player feel lost. They should always know what to do next. That's not true for old school. Old school players are accustomed to getting lost or trapped or having to find secret doors and so forth. And old school players must be allowed to gather information or choose not to in order to counter the fact that they have less hand-holding. They've got to provide their own hand-holding in effect. Old school is about behaving like you might die. Your character, yes, but you put yourself into your character. So you rely on stratagems, which is to say trickery. You treat fighting as a war, not a sport. If you fight a fair fight, you screwed up. Never give a sucker an even break. All's fair in war. New school doesn't have to worry much, if at all, about dying, so they can treat battles as sport, and the GM or the game will bail them out if necessary. Do rules make a difference? Of course. Look at 5th edition D&D, where it's much harder to die than in 1st edition, owing to easy and frequent healing and spells like Revivify. It leans toward new school in this respect. But a GM is a much bigger influence than the rules. The GM can, of course, modify the rules, but again, remember it's about attitudes, much more than about rules. Now here's a summary. Make it a game, something players can lose or fail at it. It's about the game first, story second. Make players earn what they achieve. It's for the good of the group, not the individual. Encourage cooperation, and of course, if it's a game they can lose, they'll cooperate. Let players decide, player agency. Highs require lows. More constraints on what the players can do. Don't let them get away with whatever they want to do. Much less hand-holding. Stratagems, war not sport. Now, this may sound harsh, but it's the way typically Dungeons and Dragons was played when it first came out, although there were lots of deviations and lots of wildness. But nowadays, typically RPGs are played a different way. Thanks for listening.